Good afternoon and welcome to the joint webinar of ICT Legal Consulting and Tresorit, How to Get Ready for the GDPR, Securing the Cloud. I'm pleased to welcome our two hosts, data protection lawyer Paolo Balboni, professor, founding partner of ICT Legal Consulting and president of the European Privacy Association, and Istvan Lam, co-founder and CEO at Tresorit. We will collect questions from our participants during the webinar. In the top left corner of your Zoom interface, you will see a Q&A button. Please post your questions here and our hosts will get to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Paolo and Istvan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. If we can go to the next slide, please. So, first of all, we are talking about the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the new European privacy regulation that is going to be directly applicable in all the member states starting from the 25th of May 2018. One thing that is very important to share with you, especially for the people connected that are not lawyers, is to understand that the General Data Protection Regulation is already in force since May 2016. And it is going to be directly applicable in all member states starting from May 2018, which means that if we already comply now with the General Data Protection Regulation, that will be perfectly in compliance with European privacy law. And the whole idea of giving 2 years of time for the organization to comply with this new regulation is related to the fact that there are quite significant changes and quite of a significant difference in approach to data protection compliance. Next slide, please. Well, before we get into the three game changers, so the three main novelties of the GDPR, I think it's very important to understand to which kind of organizations the GDPR applies. First and foremost, to all organizations that are established in the European Union. But interestingly enough, the regulation will also apply to organizations that are actually established outside the European Union, but either offer product and services to European citizens, or if they are monitoring their behavior. So we are also looking at the application of the GDPR to, for example, organization operating e-commerce website from outside the European Union and selling products and services to European citizens. Or we are also looking at the application of the GDPR to online behavioral advertisers that are monitoring the behavior of European citizens. Next slide, please. We need to agree and share the definition of personal data because actually personal data is defined in a very, very broad way. In fact, personal data is any information directly or indirectly to related to an individual. So I think for the most of you, it will be quite easy to think of a name, a surname, an email address, a telephone number, physical address. But it is also worth stressing that an IP address is considered personal data, and also a MAC address is considered personal data. So if on the one side, the definition of personal data is very broad, and on the other side, also the definition of processing is very broad, because it is basically any activity on personal data, including visualizing personal data and deleting personal data, then we can conclude that every time that we are carrying out activities on information, well, that will most likely be processing of personal data. And therefore, it's important to understand which are the main rules of engagement pursuant to the GDPR. Next slide, please. So the first game changer, the introduction of the principle of accountability. I decided to display this picture of a counter because it should evoke in your mind the idea of recording privacy transaction. Like a counter is recording transactions and in fact collecting evidence of compliance, the same should be done for data protection. So every time that an organization is processing personal data, the first question that a data protection officer or privacy compliance officer should bear in mind is how am I collecting evidence of compliance? Meaning that, for example, if I'm doing a collection of personal data on a website interface, I would need to log the IP address related to the user. I would need to log the specific time and action made to click on the consent button or ticking on the box. And everything should be preserved, retained, in order to be able to show actually compliance to the supervisory authority. So first game changer, fundamental. We need to record evidence of compliance at all time. Next slide, please. Second game changer, privacy is becoming risk-based. So it is not anymore that we will have a law telling us specifically which kind of obligations and duties we have with respect to personal data. But in a substantial part of the provision of the GDPR, everything is related to evaluation on the risk of that specific data processing on the data subject. So every time that we do compliance, we will not have a checklist from the law, but we will have to run a risk assessment. And I think this is pretty new, especially for lawyers, because I have to say, me included, we are not trained to do risk analysis. And therefore, it is very, very important that whenever an organization is undertaking a compliance activity with respect to the GDPR, this organization will be assisted by a team of professionals made both of lawyers and IT security experts. And this is another very fundamental change of the GDPR. Privacy compliance is not anymore just for lawyers, but it is increasingly more for IT and IT security professionals. Actually, the best would be to have them both in the same team. And this is basically what we do, how we work as a team in ICT Legal Consulting, my law firm. Another important principle that is related to the one of like being a risk-based compliance is the principle of privacy by design and by default, which namely means that in any kind of data processing that we are designing, we need to take into consideration the regulation and all the duties and obligations that the regulation imposes on organizations. Therefore, the message to you, a very practical message, is that any organization that is processing personal data should, at a very early stage, engage a data protection officer or privacy consultant in order to make sure that that specific processing activities is already starting in a way that is in line with the regulation. And this is not just to avoid sanctions, it's also to valorize data sets, databases, in order to extract value from the personal data that you are actually collecting. Next slide, please. Third game changer. Of course, a lot of people are very much focused on the sanctions, sky-high rocket sanctions, 20 million euro or 4% of total annual worldwide turnover of a group of undertakings. This is, of course, a novelty. On the other side, I think people working since years on privacy matters, we know how the supervisory authorities apply the sanctions. So to some extent, this is rather predictable, and therefore we can adjust the compliance of an organization in order to mitigate the risk of sanctions pursuant to Article 83 of the regulation, which actually sets forth the criteria that the supervisory authority will use in order to grade and establish the sanctions. What is absolutely impossible to predict is the new possibility of class actions with respect to privacy and data protection. So we see already Consumers Association and Privacy Advocacy Association hiring privacy lawyers in order to collectively represent the rights of the data subjects before the authority, before courts. And when we look at the European case law, we don't find a lot of data protection litigations. And why? Why was that? Well, basically because the data protection damage is quite difficult to prove. And even if you manage to prove it, then it's very difficult to assess the amount of the damage. And very often, for example, no more than 500 euro were given per spam message. So even if you have received, let's say, 10 spam messages and you are able to show the possible damage, 500 times 10 is just 5,000 euro, which upfront probably will not even justify engaging a lawyer in order to bring an action before the court. However, when we manage to put together in a collective way the interests and the rights of data subjects, then we may escalate to a potential very large damage. And therefore, I predicted that in the future that we will see more and more privacy litigations. And that is something that organizations should take into consideration. Also with respect to the budget, to the yearly budget, to allocate some budget also to potential privacy litigations in the years to come. Next slide, please. So what about cloud computing? Well, we could stay for an entire day to discuss how the GDPR applies to cloud computing, because there are so many different aspects. But here, we decided to focus very much on the relationship between the organization and the cloud service provider. So typically, the organization, let's say the company that decide to move to the cloud, is the data controller, and the cloud provider is the data processor. Therefore, what is absolutely fundamental is to find the right cloud service provider. And when I say right cloud service provider, I mean it from the legal perspective and the data protection perspective. So we need to find reliable partners that can demonstrate their compliance with the general data protection regulation. Most of the time, this relationship will actually be regulated by a contract, a data processing agreement between the controller and the processor. In other words, a contract between the company and the cloud service provider, specifically directed to regulate the duties and obligations with respect to the GDPR. And I think this is a very, very crucial point, because before, there was the possibility for the data processor, let's say, to be somehow shielded from responsibility, because it was only the data controller, the company, who would have suffered the imposition of sanctions, who would have been the target of damage actions from the data subject. But with the General Data Protection Regulation, controller and processor will have joint and several liability, meaning that they are exactly in the same situation. And therefore, this contract between the controller and processor is fundamental to rightly allocate duties and obligations. And on the other side, it is absolutely important to do business with parties that can, once again, demonstrate their compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation. Because if not, if the data processor is breaching the law, that will be a problem also for the data controller, for the company. Next slide, please. So now I'm just handing over to Istvan to proceed with the presentation, please.
Thank you, Paolo. So what I would like to highlight is applying technical measures and more importantly, encryption. The reason I'm talking about this is my background. I'm a cryptography engineer. I learned how to design things, and this is close to Tresorit as well, as we are doing encryption, in the cloud. So what GDPR says about encryption, that the controller and the processor shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure level of secrecy. But it's also highlighting as an example the pseudonymization and encryption. It is important that they are mentioned specifically as the right tool to protect information. The difference between the two techniques, that pseudonymization is a way to de-identify the data, so making it that specific data on a way, or transforming on a way that it cannot be attached to a private person without knowing something. For instance, an X-ray image for scientific purposes might be without name and any specific identification information, can be used or can be viewed as a pseudonymized data. But that's an X-ray image. You can view the image itself. The encryption is a stronger tool. It is actually a way to make it actually unusable. The data is completely transformed and cannot be, without the key, cannot be used for any purpose. So that it's not the same. Pseudonymization can be in that you cover the name on an X-ray, while encryption is making basically white noise out of the X-ray picture. So this is how I can show you as an example. And it also means that using an encrypted data to re-identify specific persons, if it's leaked, if it's called to the wild, it would be almost impossible, or at least it would be infeasible for an attacker to identify someone. And this is very important differences. Can the next slide, please? But it is important highlight that not encryption is created equal. There are different algorithms. One specific algorithm what is used and accepted is AES-256 or RSA. But there are other algorithms as well, which are less known but strong, or there are other algorithms which are less known and are not strong and not considered to be secure anymore. That those algorithms need to be chosen wisely, and you need to do some research on that. when we, for instance, do provide encryption tools, we always use the latest the recommendation of the standardization bodies, so that you don't need to do the research on that regard. Also, not just the algorithms, it's a piece where you put a picture in the algorithm as an input, and it creates a white noise out of it. But what is the architecture where that process takes place is very, very important from a compliance perspective. If the data encryption happens on the server side, if the data encryption happens on a server maintained by a third party, then it is different than if the data is encrypted end-to-end. Also important to highlight the key managements. When you do encryption, not just the process of the encryption, but it's also the keys need to be protected. Because if with the key, the data can be decrypted. So if the key leaks together with the encrypted data, then from compliance perspective, you cannot view that as only encrypted data is encrypted, because an attacker just using the key, using the public algorithm, can decrypt that information. Next slide, please. And ENISA has a position on it, saying that the encryption and the decrypt recover operation must be carried out locally, because the keys used in them must remain in the power of the user if any storage privacy is to be achieved. Outsourced bulk data storage on so-called clouds is practical and relatively safe as long as only the data owner, not the cloud service, holds the decryption key. What it says, it's as an engineer, for me, is explicitly talking about end-to-end encryption as differentiating from something which is happening in the at the side of the cloud provider. But let's go in details. What do I mean by that? Next slide, please. So the server-side encryption, the first part, the encryption happens in transit and at rest. There are two different encryption processes. One, the in transit, is a TLS or SSL encryption. When Alice uploads it to a server, that can be an HTTPS channel, and the server, when receiving through TLS, decrypts the information. After decrypting the information, then might re-encrypt that data while storing that information with a key known to the server. When this is a two different things. So the decryption happens and the key management happens on the server side. There is a key management for the communication with Alice from the cloud perspective, and there is another key management storing the data at rest. These two keys usually managed by the cloud provider. The process is managed by the cloud provider for sure. The next step is when Bob or the third party downloads the data. Bob in this example access the information through TLS. So another encryption happens. Bob receives it. Maybe Bob is sitting in a public place using a public Wi-Fi, but because of the channel encryption or in-transit encryption, the data is secured, but not from the clouds or server maintaining perspective. Next slide, please. In contrary, the end-to-end encryption or client-side encryption works in a way that Alice encrypts the data on her computer before uploading, but does not create a channel. It does not create a tunnel with the server, and not revealing the key to the server. So the server just receives an encrypted information and storing the information as is without decryption, without breaking up the tunnel. When Bob, the other party, downloads the data as Alice uploaded, there is no new transformation, there is no new encryption happening here. Bob downloads, and then Bob will decrypt the information, having the key on their side. It might sound quite easy, or would make sense. The problem comes when how the key is shared between Alice and Bob. That's where public key encryption and the different algorithms comes into the picture. It can be done, and it is done in end-to-end encrypted services. So why does it help to you? Why encryption helps in regarding to GDPR compliance? First, it protects the personal data from employees of the third party, the cloud provider. It's from the users, from partners, but it can be when you apply encryption inside your organization. For instance, the disk encryption. This can help you to protect information inside your organization from others. When you do end-to-end encryption, and when you upload to the cloud the data in an encrypted form, that you can view it that the personal data stays within your company walls. And this means you don't need to view as a high risk factor when you use a cloud provider, because you are not really outsourcing personal data when you are uploading end-to-end encrypted data. And with that, you can reduce liability. If something happens at the cloud provider side as a processor, or sub-processor, you don't have that liability. The cloud provider doesn't have that liability, so you don't need to worry about that. GDPR explicitly says that when encrypted data is leaked, and if the key is not leaked, with that, you don't need to do a breach notification, for instance. And that will save you cost on not need to manage a breach notification, or not to pay potential fines. Also important to that when you receive, as a company, you receive a private information, it comes with some sort of consent, an explicit consent to you, that how you can process that data. When you use a sub-processor or processor and use a cloud provider, you can hand over that data only with the similar or less consent. So this consent, for instance, if the user doesn't give you consent for automatic processing, then you cannot hand it over to Google spreadsheets and who do automatic processing in the background. You need to look. You need to look into the personal data that there are limitations what you can do with it, and when you hand it over to someone, that limitations must be mirrored. And when you use encryption, then you don't need to give consent, because it's a minimal consent what you require to use an encrypted cloud storage. And obviously, when you use encryption and combining with the public clouds, you can use the benefits of the cloud, the higher accuracy of the data centers, the flexibility, the better payment terms, and so on. So at the same time, you can use the cloud and have the personal data within your company walls. Next slide, please. And Tresorit is an end-to-end encrypted cloud provider, and we are a Swiss provider. We are on the market since 2011, and in our service, everything is end-to-end encrypted automatically. You don't need to deal with that. And we make sure that the latest and the strongest algorithms are used to protect information. And when you want to use it for your company, inside your company, or when you collaborate with external parties, it can be a good solution with that. And we also provide control and governance features on top of that, which is important from showing the regulators that you are actually doing preventive measures other than just encrypting. I need to also mention that there are other providers and then encrypted providers, ProtonMail or Tutanota. Also for messaging, direct messaging, there's Wire or Trima, and with that you can use as a chat service between inside your company or with someone else. So maybe what isn't my role to wrap up. So let's summarize, and maybe I would like to ask Paolo to help me summarizing the first two points.
Yeah, sure. I think by summarizing, we can already address some of the questions that
Sure.
that we have received. Well, more from the legal side, and then I leave it to you more the technical side. When we look at a relationship with a cloud service provider, and let's say we are an organization, we are a company, as I said in my presentation, the company is the controller and the cloud service provider is a processor. One question is what is a controller and what is a processor, and it's totally understandable because these are legal terms. And the controller is basically the entity that is deciding the purposes and the means of the data processing. So let's say that you are a company and you are collecting customer data in order to provide them with goods and services, and then you also collect the data for marketing purposes. Let's say that you are also storing the data in a CRM and you are profiling those data. You see, you are deciding what to do with the data that you are collecting. But because you don't have the computational capacity to deal with those data inside your company, you may look outside your company for an IT service provider, which can be a cloud computing service provider. And the provider will not and shall not decide the means and the purposes for processing the personal data, but the provider should simply process the personal data on the behalf of the company, meaning that the data controller is the brain of the data processing, and the processor is just an entity that is processing the personal data under the instruction and on behalf of the controller. And it should just remain so, because this is the fundamental distinction between the two roles. We said that when you start a business relationship with a cloud service provider, you should also have in place a data processing agreement pursuant to Article 28 of the regulation. Article 28 of the regulation is also setting forth the necessary elements in order to correctly draft and allocate duties and obligations between the two parties. So this is going to be a fundamental legal compliance document whenever you are establishing a relationship with a cloud service provider. Then before to hand over to you more technical questions, I would like also to address a few comments related to encryption and anonymization. I think it is very important to understand that encryption is not a way to anonymize personal data. Encryption is a way to secure personal data. End-to-end encryption is a very secure way to deal with personal data. In fact, when you look at Article 32 of the GDPR, it is recommended to use encryption. It is not mandatory because, as I said at the beginning, the organizations should put in place security measures which are in respect to the risk of their data processing to the data subjects. But it is, let's say, highly recommendable to have encryption. And as Istvan rightly said, encryption may also be an interesting security measure to have in the situation where there may be a data breach, because if we manage to assess that in fact the data that were leaked from our organization are robustly encrypted, then we may not fall under the obligation pursuant to Article 34 of the regulation of communicating the data breach to our clients or the data subjects. And if there is no risk at all, because as I said, the data are robustly encrypted, then we may even avoid, pursuant to Article 33, to notify to the Data Protection Authority. However, we will always need to annotate in our records of data breaches that that specific breach has occurred, and therefore we need to make this compliance evidence always available to supervisory authority. But I think it's very important for all the people listening not to assimilate encryption with anonymization. Encryption is a very robust way to secure personal data, or let's say as robust as the encryption technique, let's say.
There is a question here more specifically from Thomas. If the data subject has the only key to decrypt the encrypted personal data, can this be considered as anonymous data? And it's my view on this is that rightly encrypted data is more than anonymous, because it cannot be when you encrypt something, it cannot be even viewed as a data. You don't see the structure of the data. That's why I use the white noise as a picture. But what is your view, Paolo, on this? It cannot be considered.
Yeah. I think from the technical perspective, you may have a point. From the legal perspective, because personal data is so broadly defined, and also whenever we talk about anonymous data, we're talking about data that can never be reconciled with the identity of a data subject. However, the General Data Protection Regulation extend the scope of the definition of personal data, of the data processing, and also specify that data is only anonymous when a data controller cannot reconcile that information with the identity of the data subject, not only leveraging the information in its own possession, but also information in possession of third parties. And therefore, it will be very difficult to argue that an encrypted data is in fact an anonymized data, regardless of where the key is. However, on the other side, what you have explained in differences between techniques of encryption, they may play a very, very significant role with respect to security measures that providers can assure to apply to their customers.
Mm-hmm. There is another question from Paul. If a solicitor has passed our company a user data to write reports on, do we have rights to store that data without further requesting the users to store their data?
Well, I think I would need a little bit more of context in order to conclusively reply to this question, but I can try to provide an answer anyway. It is always very important to understand the data privacy role. Who is the controller and who is the processor? Let's say that in the present case, we have a law firm, and this law firm is outsourcing a specific task to a third party, which is writing a report. Therefore, that third party is once again acting on behalf of the controller. So the question is not whether the third party needs to have consent or other legal means for processing the personal data. This is a legal obligation that rests on the controller, on the law firm, on the subject that asked in first place the third party to do some activities on the personal data. And once again, the relationship between the two parties, the law firm and the third-party service provider, needs to be regulated by an adequate data processing agreement according to Article 28 of the regulation.
Okay, another question. I cannot. It was a more legal question, but this the next question from Matthew. Matthew, sorry, can you repeat this? You mean if we upload encrypted data for transfer abroad, it is considered as staying in our wallet as long as the data are encrypted and the key is kept secure. And this is, I think we need to differentiate the two scenarios if it's non-EU and EU case, because to be honest, even though I'm deep inside the GDPR, the abroad question is a little bit vague, but that will pass to Paolo. But well, just to finish with, let's say the data is stored within the EU, but at the third party. Let's say Tresorit stores the data on behalf of you, and you encrypt the data on your device before it's uploaded. And it can be considered as something in your walls. I know it's maybe it's an oversimplification of a complex case, but because of as we mentioned that if Tresorit leaks the encrypted files, you are not facing with fines, and it is different. But as Paolo mentioned, you need to still know that Tresorit leaked the encrypted files. So it is less than a breach, but more than nothing. So it is somewhere between, but significantly better case, significantly better than uploading without encryption. So in that case, our view that you can look at the security as having encrypted in your company, that the data is actually stored within your company if it's in the EU. If not, then the question complicates. But maybe Paolo can put a little bit more light on this.
Yeah, as far as I understood, because I think the specific question was also related to the data transfer to third countries.
Yeah,
so
that's why I wanted to divide.
So once again, encrypted data are still personal data, and if you are transferring those data to a third country, then you need to secure the transfer according to a legitimate means for transferring model clauses or BCR or consent or performance of a contract and so on and so forth. So I think once again we are coming back to the concept of the fact that from the strictly legal perspective, and encrypted data is not anonymized. And when there is the possibility to have access to that data from a third country, then this means data processing from a third country, and therefore this amount to data transfer to a third country, which needs to be properly regulated according to the GDPR.
And just because Matthew has also put more light on the question, said abroad in this case means to a company located in the third country. Is there a difference between EU and
country does not have to regulate into other lawful means, like I mentioned.
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Can you repeat? Maybe it's mine.
I was just basically restating my answer of before. Protection regulation as a country that do not belong to the European Economic Area. From the European Commission. Therefore, the data transfer needs to be regulated by alternative means, alternative legal means that are, as a matter of example, the one that I mentioned before, standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, consent of the data subject, or maybe the transfer is necessary in order to comply with a specific legal obligation, and so on and so forth.
Sorry if I was breaking up. The next question was related to CRM. Wonder if data on CRM can be archived and pseudonymized. There it is basic. It's very hard what in case of a CRM, but because at the CRM side, the CRM is usually doing some transformation on the private data, so that the CRM system is itself might look up in another database the same name, might provide you suggestions, might want to, for instance, send out email in that case, and that or when you pseudonymize a data, you cannot have, for instance, email address in that case. But then how can you use a CRM automatic email sending function? There are ways to secure CRM and applications in general, but usually what in this server heavy operation, usually the data, the service is secured, not the so the service itself has its borders and has its vaults to secure itself. For instance, having rights firewalls, having right controls, and also auditing every logging in, monitoring that, also having the SSL, at-rest encryption. Those are technical measures which can protect the CRM system as itself. And end-to-end encryption for a CRM system is hard, and you may lose a lot of functionality within the CRM. I know it's a pseudonymized. It relates to the pseudonymized data, but it's when you pseudonymize it, it's true for that as well. Just again, I think Thomas' question was if the data is that was Paul Matthew's question. Tara, the idea would be to regularly archive data from CRM, CAT, pseudonymized or archived. I don't really understand. Maybe Paulo, you can help us, or Tara can. You can send a confirmation what you meant by this question. So again, the idea would be to regularly archive data from the CRM, CAT, pseudonymized or archived.
I don't know. I think we need to have a little bit more information on that. It's not completely clear.
Okay, so let's move to the next question. What is the necessary certification to ask to cloud provider in terms of encryption and other cybersecurity stuff? Well, and let me put what, from technical perspective, what I think is important. One is the algorithms is in use, and the architecture, how they secure, and what are the technical measures. Briefly, looking at it as a description, and it might be important that it comes in a binding form, that the provider, the cloud provider, make commitment to do that and provide that the service in a way that those technical measures are in place. For instance, in Tresorit terms of use, we commit that we do end-to-end encryption, and we do it on a way that we encrypt it on a way that the files cannot be viewed by us. But what's your view? What is your view on this, Paolo?
Well, there is no specific certification requirement provided for in the GDPR. In fact, once again, I want to go back to the idea of risk assessment, and based on this risk assessment on the personal data and the possible risk that the data processing may potentially cause to data subjects, then both controller and processors they need to implement adequate security measures. So in that word adequate, there is the risk assessment on the one side, and there is the principle of accountability, so providing evidence of having fulfilled that adequate security level, which can be technically achieved by, for example, encryption. And in that respect, once again, there is no silver bullet, there is no certification that if you get it, then you are fine. You need to look into the encryption techniques as you have to look into security techniques in general to understand whether they are adequate with respect to the data processing that the controller is undertaking. So yeah, this is I think the answer from the legal perspective.
Thank you. The next question from Anna. As a recruiter, if I make notes about the candidate during an interview, is this considered personal data? In other words, does the candidate have a right to request access to it? And is it a personal notes? Because personal notes are usually not in the scope of GDPR, and I think, what is it, the professional notes? Because the professional recruiter. What's your view on this, Paolo?
Yeah, well, for sure we can answer the first question, which is, well, the answer is yes, they are personal data because they are information related to an individual. The individual is the candidate. I think it is. It will be very interesting for the person that posed that question to read through, to analyze the recent opinion of Article 29 Working Party, which is, let's say, the assembly of supervisory authorities. What is going to be the future? The European Data Protection Board is going to transform into the European Data Protection Board, because they have released earlier this year a very interesting opinion on data processing in the employment environment. And actually, they have touched upon quite a number of specific matters related to recruiting, and even using social media for recruitment purposes, and so on and so forth. So what I can tell from the little context that that was provided is that the data subject can always ask to exercise his or her access right, which could be either limited to the reply, yes, we have information related to you, which are, for example, name, surname, the position that you have in the company, age, and so on and so forth, and provide also the logic, so the finality for which the data are kept, like for recruitment purposes, therefore evaluation and this kind of assessment, these kind of things. And also, for example, the retention period, so for how long the data will be retained. Access to the specific notes, you were right before, Istvan, when you discuss the matter. It really depends what we are talking about in the sense of private note taken by the recruiter. Moreover, there is, and this is important to stress, here we are in the intersection between labor law and data protection. So labor law is always regulated at the member state level. So in order to answer that question, there will be also the need to understand what applicable labor law will say in this respect. But I think what I want to share with you is really have a look at these guidelines of Article 29 Working Party on data protection in the employment context, because there may be a lot of useful information also with respect to recruiting.
Thank you. And it's also, I think it is important to highlight the difference when you are doing as a business or you are taking the notes as a private person. So two friends together sitting and as a recruiter giving advice on something, and maybe you take some notes, but as a private person, not as a business, I think that makes a difference. Is that right, Paolo? That the real personal, so that from
yeah, there is always it is, let's say, confirmed by the GDPR, the so-called household exception. So whatever you do in your private capacity does not fall under the GDPR. However, it is becoming more and more difficult to assess what is done in your private capacity versus professional capacity, because especially referring to this specific opinion of Article 29 Working Party, they are very well describing the thin line of using social media for private and professional purposes. Like we all know that maybe years ago, Facebook was mainly used for private purposes, but now Facebook is substantially used for professional purposes, marketing purposes, but also recruiting purposes, and in order to profile the users in terms of potential candidates for a position open in a company, and so on and so forth. So I would not rely too much on the household exception, which is the GDPR does not apply when you process personal data in your personal capacity, because this personal capacity is eroding, let's say, the perimeter of the pure personal capacity is eroding.
Yeah, thank you. Madi, question: what do I tell my management when they say we will never get audited especially not next year because it is a new law, so we don't really care about it. I think it is let me put my views on it and then hand it over to Paolo as well. But I think it is important to demonstrate actions. If you cannot demonstrate any actions and improvements in your practices, then you may face with the higher end of the fines. Well, if you can demonstrate at least a few that you did something, yes, not everything is perfect, but at least you did something, then you should work on that. And it is not simple. So it is not a one-way job. If you need to do it overnight, your costs will be extremely high when it comes to, for instance, you want to implement it. If you take the time and implement the perfect compliance a little bit later than May 2018, but you can demonstrate you are getting there and you are progressing. In my view, that is that make a significant difference when it comes to fines. What's your view on this, Paolo?
Yeah, I think I can subscribe what you said. Actually, to put it in more legal terms, you described a diligent approach to the compliance with the GDPR and also a way to fulfill the principle of accountability. I understand the possible frustration of people working in companies that are not very sensitive about privacy and data protection, and as a matter of fact, has been dealt with so far as a pure burden, as a pure cost, administrative cost. And I think the whole new approach that the GDPR is bringing on is very difficult to digest for companies, and it's very difficult for data protection officers or privacy experts to explain the management of companies. The changes and also the fact that data protection it is not just a burden but can be an asset. Data protection compliance is an asset for IT service providers, for example, and they will compete more and more in reassuring clients that they comply with the law because there are high fines, because the joint and several liability that I mentioned before between the controller and the processor. But even if we look at companies, a company that is actually collecting personal data in the right way is a company that can then further process the personal data in order to create value. Before we discussed about a CRM, when you want to build a strong CRM, you also want to profile your customers, you want to create patterns, you want to analyze those personal data, you want to infer valuable information in order to take actions to develop products and services that are more in line with the preferences of your customers and potential customers. But if you haven't done a strategic data collection, not only in line with the GDPR, but also thinking together with your business, what do we want to do with those data in the future, then you haven't prepared well for extracting value from the databases. And let's say that this company also wants to share those personal data with possible business partners. If you haven't requested, for example, the prior consent or found another legitimate legal basis, you cannot do it. And that means that you are not monetizing the asset, which is the database. So I fully understand the remark, because it's something that comes up, especially when we look at small and medium enterprises, but I have to say also sometimes in large enterprises. But privacy is changing, and the organization that I mainly speak about, large organizations, the large organization that do not change their approach in terms of turning the burden into a possible asset and even in order to procure return on investment, I think that will lag behind the competition in the digital era.
And what I would like to add to that, there's two things. If the company is in the consumer area, and if the company is having more consumers as customers, then you should tell them that it's more like GDPR is more like a regulation for banks. Would you give the money to a bank which cannot demonstrate that they will take care of that? With following this metaphor, would you provide as a private person to a controller who cannot demonstrate they will take care of that? And I know not every people might think on that way, but privacy consciousness is increasing, so that's important, and that can be a differentiator on the market. Another thing, if it's more a B2B, or your business is more B2B, then you can differentiate. Your business partners will ask, as a processor or sub-processor, can you assure us of with GDPR assurance, or can you assure us that with GDPR compliance? Sorry, GDPR compliance, and if you cannot demonstrate that, you may lose some projects, you may lose revenue, while risking fines. But it's important that that other businesses will look into this and will consider it as an important thing, and it will put you pressure on that, and starting it when you feel the real need for that will be late, because your competitors will already doing implementation. There are a few other questions, but quickly would like to react on that. Matthew asked that, can your service solution encrypt all electronic transfer end to end? Shorts, unfortunately not. If you think about that, when you encrypt data, the data cannot be used for, it cannot be transformed, or it is very hard to do specific transformation. For instance, using a CRM system is very hard. We started a development program called ZeroKit. It's on a website. It can be built inside an application, but the application developer need to use that. And when we do end-to-end encryption in our file sharing system, we did it on a way that it's still easy to use. The second question from can different keys be used? For example, is there a new key for every new communication? We, for instance, in Tresorit, every file get a new freshly generated key. So in that case, all files are definitely encrypted. This is how we can assure secrecy. There are two questions I'm looking at. Do we have time for? Okay, for those. Tara responded that the data are active on CRM. Could it be archived separately in a pseudonymized or encrypted manner? It's I think archiving is a question. In archiving, in several cases, for instance, if you do that for a specific purpose, like financial regulation and tax requirements, your bills, electronic invoices need to be archived for at least 5 years, even though you say that you will delete the data. But what's your view on, Paolo, if there is no specific law which says you need to archive the data, does it make difference if the data, when you archive it, is pseudonymized or encrypted? Shortly, because we're running out of time.
Not really, in the sense that once again, pseudonymized and encrypted data are still personal data, so they're still subject to the principle of finality, proportionality, and data minimization, and therefore you always need to ask yourself, why am I keeping the data? And as you rightly said, Istvan, either there is a law that asks you to do that, or you have a legal interest to do that, which need to be documented in case of the supervisory authority will run an inspection, or the data needs to be simply deleted according to such principle.
Thank you. And the last question for today from Hannah: using the service of MailChimp USA for sending our newsletters to our subscriber, is it enough to specify this fact in our privacy policy to ask the consent for the data transfer abroad and to stipulate a data processing agreement with MailChimp?
Well, I'll take this one. It's a legal question. Yeah. The data transfer between Europe and the US must have a legal basis. So I think the first thing to check is whether MailChimp is certified Privacy Shield, which is one way to transfer personal data to the US. Should MailChimp not be being certified, we need to look into a different possibility. I always suggest not to use the consent in order to systematically transfer personal data, because consent can be revoked at any time without any reason by the data subject. So a way to transfer personal data to the US to MailChimp, which is typically a data processor, I think should be standard contractual clauses 2010 from controller to processor. That will be much more reliable than consent. And then the last question, whether you need to share that information with the data subject. According to Article 13 of the GDPR, so the article on information notice, yes, you need to share with the data subject whether the organization is transferring personal data to third countries, and you also need to indicate the basis for it. You are not literally requested to mention the name of MailChimp, because you are requested to share with the data subject the recipients or the category of recipients to whom you send the personal data to, you share the personal data with. And therefore, you can also phrase the privacy policy by saying that data are shared with IT service providers, for example, email platform providers, in the US or in a third country, and the data transfer is based on, for example, a Privacy Shield or standard contractual clauses. And of course, you need to have a data processing agreement in place with MailChimp. That was the very last question.
Okay. I would like to thank you, Paolo, and I would like to thank you all participants.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you to joining us today for this this session. There are, if you would like to receive more information, please contact us. You can find the contacts to ICT and to Tresorit as well, and also there you can view our website for further information and further materials. This webcast has been recorded, and it will be uploaded to our website, so you can look it back, and also the materials will be uploaded there, so you will be able to use it. There are a few other questions. Matthew, will reach out to you for following up your questions. If any other questions pops up, please reach out to us, and we try to do our best to answer. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a nice day.